Welcome, everyone. We are waiting for people in the waiting list to appear. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are joining us from. This is the INDIGO Peer Learning group session. We have those regularly, and the topic today is what's in a performance number and how do we use it? It's my pleasure to welcome you to a quite learning focus session, like most of our peer learning session. As you've seen, it's being recorded. So if you want to share information, be aware that this is going to be shared publicly. So my name is Mara Roldi, and I'm the academic director of the Government Outcomes Lab at the Blavatsky School of Government. At the school, we host a learning collaborative on data, which is INDIGO, and regularly we have sessions like the one today. Can we start sharing the slide, please? I'll start by giving you an overview of what's going to happen in this session. As you know, it's going to be a 1 hour session. I already mentioned it's being recorded, and it's really important that you keep your microphone on mute. It's a very friendly environment and session for those of you who come regularly. So we will pause several times for Q&A. Post your question in the chat. We will pick them up as soon as we have an opportunity. And when that happens, I will ask you to unmute and enjoy the session. So we feel really part of a community of friends. The session today will start with a recap on something we touched upon at the Social Outcome Conference 2024. We had a big picture session, one of the plenary sessions, that looked at, it was called Putting the Puzzle Together. And we were looking at how we could put together data and evidence on outcome-based contracting. How do you report this information? What can you learn from this reporting? Much of this work comes from the work that we're doing in collaboration with colleagues at the Department for Culture, Media and Sport in the UK that supports the GoLab. And it's part of the evaluation of the Life Chances Fund, which is a big initiative that supports 29 impact bonds in the UK. These impact bonds are in implementation, and the performance information is becoming available. And we had a session at the conference that we will refresh briefly with Juliana at the beginning of today. We are then very fortunate to have Professor Oliver James from Exeter University with us, who is an expert on public policy, and in particular on the interface between policymakers and citizens, and how citizens and various users make sense of the data that is available around public policies. We also have with us a practitioner who works a lot with data, who is Benoit Renard from Triggerrise, who I will introduce again later. Professor Oliver will give some overview of his work and will provide some recommendations. Benoit will give us a practitioner perspective, and we hope that this is a good food for thought for our conversation throughout the afternoon. As I said, I will pause regularly for Q&A, and will conclude with some closing remarks. Please introduce yourself in the session, in the chat if you haven't yet. And as I said, don't hesitate to post your questions as we go along. Juli, I'll pass the microphone to you to remind us the great work that you've been doing in the past few years.
Thanks, Mara. If we go to the next slide. Great. What I want to do now is a very, very short recap of the data and the data visualizations that we presented during the Social Outcomes Conference this year. And I'm going to be very brief, I promise. When we speak about performance data from social impact bonds, we are usually referring to two different things. We are referring to data on outcome achievements, and we are referring to data on outcome payments. That's what we're going to show today. Performance is a broader term and it refers to many more things. This is what we could do up to now with the data from the Life Chances Fund projects. But the idea for today is to also think a bit more, what else can we do with this data? In what other ways we can represent it to make sure that more practitioners and more policymakers can put it to good use. If we go to the next slide, we are going to see one example of one of the Life Chances Fund projects. This is the data visualizations for the skill mill, which is a project on criminal justice funded by the Life Chances Fund. And first of all, I want to say this is interim data. These are interim results. The skill mill is an ongoing project which will deliver a service until September 2024. So they still have more or less a year to deliver a service and achieve more outcomes. What we are representing here is outcome achievements. And this is a bar graph where every bar represents an outcome metric. On the top of the bar, you can see the overall targets for that particular metric. And I'm referring to targets for the whole project. So these are not quarterly targets. These are the targets for the entire project. Our expectation is that when time goes by, we're going to see the green part of the bar growing. You see the achievements up to September 2023, because that's the latest data that we get from the Life Chances Fund data platform. And you can see that the level of achievement varies depending on the metric that we are referring to. As you can imagine, there are some metrics where achievement is more straightforward than others. If you go to the impact bond data set, this is an interactive data visualization. So you can hover over the different bars and you can see the description of the metric, you can see the target, and you can see the exact number of the achievements. So for example, if we were to hover over the first bar, we would see that this is a bar representing metric number 1, a young person registers for the skill mill program. The target for the entire project is 252 individuals, and up to September 2023, 227 individuals have registered for the skill mill program. Again, this is interim data. This is what we know of the skill mill until now. If we go to the second slide, we will see a data visualization on outcome payments. And this data visualization is representing both payment plans and actual payments. The dotted lines represent different payment plans that the project had at different moments, and each dotted line is made of a set of points. Each point represents a quarter, and if you go to the impact bond data set, users can hover over these dots and they can see the amount of funds that the project was expecting to receive in each particular quarter. You will see that there are different dotted lines. That's because a project can change and adapt during the life of service delivery, and they can change plans. You will see that this project in particular had some different plans, but they all look very similar to one another. If you go to the impact bond data set, you will see other projects that change more drastically. If you see, or if you look closely at the black solid line, that's the line on actual payments. That's the line that represents actual payments that the skill mill received because of all the outcomes that have been achieved and that were shown in the previous graph. I know it's a bit difficult to interpret this one because for every project you may have different plans. So if you go to the next slide, I prepared I took two different screenshots. The first one is comparing the skills mill first payment plan against actual payments. And you can see that the line is going very close to the initial plans. And the other one is comparing the skill mill final payment plan against actual payments. You will see that there is a difference, that the latest payment plan is a bit longer. And that's because this project included more commissioners in the middle of the life of service delivery. So this project has a bigger maximum potential outcome payment and is going for longer because they included more commissioners after 2021. I also invite you to, again, to go to the impact bond data set and to see the interactive graphs because you will see the different numbers in each line. You can also select and deselect the different plans. And most importantly, if we go to the next slide, you will see how we present the data and what's the right way of interpreting this. If I show you just these two data visualizations, sometimes it's a bit short-sighted because you only see some numbers on some achievements. But the right way to do this is to interpret the performance in the broader context of all the other data that is coming out of these projects. this is what the project page in the impact bond data set looks for the skill mill. You see that there is much more data. There is data on the investment, data on the maximum potential outcome payments. There is data on the type of intervention that they are working with, on the type of the cohort, the target population, the different places where they are delivering the service, the different organizations that are involved in this project. And what I find is the most interesting bit. You will see that below the graph, the projects got some space to provide their own context and interpretation to the data. And that's because the projects know what's the story that they want to share, and they know what's the story behind each of these metrics and what are the things that they had to deal with, the challenges and the opportunities. So I guess that my final message is that I want to invite you all to go and take these data visualizations in the impact bond data set. And I also, what I expect to get out of this session is to get some ideas and to discuss what other things we could do with this data and what other ways we could represent it to make sure that more people can use this data, and this data is also useful for practitioners and policymakers thinking of future projects. I will be looking at the chat to see if I have any questions, but I think it's back to you, Mara.
Thank you, Juli. So I'm happy to pose if there are any questions to Juliana and the experience of gathering and sharing information. I can see a hand up. No, disappeared.
Can I ask the
Yes,
question?
please.
Okay. Hi, I'm Shamul Hassan. I'm from Islamic Development Bank based in Jeddah. My question is that it's interesting analysis which you shared. Thank you for that. How do you see the need of baseline, because that is important for comparison and really to draw the analysis, meaningful analysis. So without baseline, what are your challenges in terms of like data analysis? That is one. Secondly, when you really look at the what is the level of results, like when you say outputs and then link it with the outcome analysis, what is the level at which you really look at the performance, the graph which you shared? Is that the outcome level or basically the aggregation of the outputs?
Great, thank you. That's a very interesting question, and that really speaks to this idea that I have on what else we can do with this data. All these projects have very specific baselines, and the baselines are part of the Life Chances Fund data platform. We are not working with the baselines right now because this is all interim data. These are projects that they are delivering services right now. These are ongoing projects. But our idea for the final evaluation of this project is to have a better comparison with the baselines. And this is something that should be happening, I think, in 2025 when we do the final evaluation report. And then it's also true that some of these metrics are not what we would call outcomes, but this is because usually the primary outcome is at the end, is the final metric. And then there is also a model where you reward these projects for achieving engagement and for achieving different activities that theory indicates would lead you to the outcome at the end of the project. So it's true that probably engagement wouldn't qualify as an outcome as we think as an outcome. But if you look at the final metrics of these projects, they are about this particular project, which is the skill mill. They are about getting people, ex-offenders into jobs, or getting ex-offenders into better education, with better education qualifications, or to get them into more education programs. So I think that probably the first metric was not the best example to show, but if you go and look at the latest ones, those are the proper outcomes. But I think this is a great question, and I'm happy to keep discussing this in the future.
Thank you, Juliana. Thank you.
Thank you, Juli. Max, I think this answers your question too, in terms of whether we consider the first metric of registration as an outcome, or do you want to add to that, Max?
I suppose I thought it might be better to more explicitly differentiate between outputs and outcomes, and you seem to have that as an outcome metric around somebody registering. And I would have felt it's much better to sort of have a what your main outcomes are and somehow link the different outputs to the outcomes. And not, it seems as if you on that graph as if you're considering them all equally. So I suppose that's why I was suggesting that you keep them output separate from your outcomes, so it's clear which ones you consider are what we're really trying to achieve in that project.
Yeah, I think it's a great suggestion, and we can think how to develop this a bit more whenever these projects are done. Maybe we can separate the outputs from the outcomes and see what's the level of achievement there. But yeah. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. There are some good examples also in the chat. I encourage you to follow the link suggested by Andrew Levitt. And if okay, I'll move right along. And it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Oliver James from the University of Exeter, where he's a professor of political sciences. He's, as I mentioned at the beginning, his focus is the public policy, including how citizens interact with the state, in particular in terms of accountability of public service delivery, and how public service users participate in the delivery of these services. And also he works on the evaluation of policy outcomes. In 2020, he co-authored a very interesting book for our audience that is called Behavioral Public Performance, How People Make Sense of Government Metric. And we asked Professor James to give us a snapshot of his research, in particular when it comes to responding to metrics and what is being published and how different audiences respond to it. Oliver, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mara. And I think Sheree is going to help me with the presenting the slides. Thank you very much. So I was really pleased to have this invitation from the Go Lab, and you know, obviously aware of your excellent work in this area. And what I'm going to try to do briefly is put some of these questions in a sort of broader context about the way that performance information, especially sort of quantitative information about public services and government outcomes, are received, processed and used and inform decisions by a range of different stakeholders, politicians, public managers, citizens, public service users, investors, and so on. And this work draws on, as Mara was mentioning, a recent short book I did with some colleagues called Behavioral Public Performance, which sort of puts this issue about how numbers are interpreted, understood, and acted upon within what we call a sort of behavioral perspective, and draws on some of the latest sort of academic research on this topic. So if I could have the next slide, please. So just to be clear what we're talking about when we talk about numerical performance information, the things around evidence that has a sort of numerical characteristic, some sort of measures of outcomes, perhaps for public services, or for policy in general, things like air quality or measures of educational outcomes, or the sort of outcomes that you're talking about in relation to particular projects that are aimed to improve education or training of individuals. And of course, this information is about inputs, quantitative information about inputs, outputs, throughputs, efficiency, equity, and so on. But what's particularly distinctive and interesting is the growth of measures of if you like, final outcomes that impact on service users and citizens, and really measure, if you like, the things that we really ultimately care about, and things like, you know, the quality of the air, or people's well-being, or their health outcomes, or sort of happiness measures. So there's more and more of this available than ever before, and it's used by different stakeholders for different purposes. We think about politicians, managers, citizens, and public service users. But the way in which information is processed by people is not at all straightforward. And of course, it depends very much on the purposes, which really put a shadow, if you like, on the whole interpretation and use of information. So what we've been doing is synthesizing some research, and obviously, you know, doing some work ourselves on how information affects people's perceptions, how they reason about the information, and how it then forms their perceptions and beliefs about what is, what their expectations of what might happen in the future, and also their attitudes, evaluative attitudes. You know, is this a good program? Is it succeeding or not? And also their intentions, their decision making, and actions. And as I said, you know, the sorts of projects you're discussing today are very much, you know, within that scope. But if you think more generally as well, things like, you know, school league tables and rankings, measures of sort of social care outcomes. Maybe if you're going to choose a care home for a relative. These sorts of things are available to people much more than ever before. But the question is, how are they used? Next slide, please. So in terms of policymakers, often there's this sort of the idea of, you put the information out there, people rationally respond to it, they sort of inform, they update their beliefs about their perceptions of outcomes and so on. But we know from behavioral and psychologically informed research, there are a number of ways in which information is received and processed that make it much more complicated than that. So the perceptions of numbers are highly influenced by the context, and there are many cognitive limits. I mean, if you're trying to communicate with citizens, for example, only about 1 in 4 working age adults are really functionally numerate, and half adults have the levels of mathematics that are sort of what you'd expect perhaps of a 10-year-old. So in terms of informing a public debate, it's actually quite difficult to do that with more sophisticated quantitative outcome measures, for example. There's also a lot of biases and misunderstandings. If you think about the way that retailers will price at £4.99 rather than £5, that's obviously because of the left digit bias that people process information in more limited ways. And actually, public managers and politicians are much less immune from some of these biases than you might think. The research shows that often people find it difficult to use numbers to inform evaluative judgments. But even worse than this, or even compounding these things, in the context of politically contested programs and programs where there is a debate about the merits of the programs, there is strong motivated reasoning about the use of evidence, including numbers, that people will ignore evidence that disconfirms their expectations and tend to sort of overemphasize evidence that's consistent. And this is sometimes driven by partisan identity and values and so on, but we also know that managers will sometimes have some biases around wanting to sort of find success in their programs, and these things need to be considered with the interpretation and use of information. Next slide, please. So what we've been doing is having this sort of general approach to public performance information. It's about thinking of the factors that affect the searching for, the reception, the use, the processing, and how information informs, numerical information informs judgment. So these things, just to sort of summarize the overall idea, there are sort of 3 sort of elements that affect this. Part is the nature of the data. We know that, for example, if you have comparative data, that's very powerful for people because they can compare over time, or particularly with peers, relevant peers, and that can be very useful to people. But there are this whole range of biases and so on that affect the nature of the data, and of course, difficulty of comprehending it. Recipients' characteristics is sort of second factor, just things like numerical ability, but also the social and political incentives and motivations for people to use information. And obviously, if you have information in an incentivized sort of contractual situation, then there are obviously particular incentives to presenting information in a particular way, perhaps from some actors. And thirdly, the context matters a lot. So in terms of citizens' receptions of information about government performance, many citizens are skeptical about government activity. And so in that context, it's very hard for there to be a sort of neutral debate informed, even if we have these measures as sort of supposed sort of policy outcomes. Although I do think that having these outcomes really is potentially beneficial for sort of informing perceptions and satisfaction. And there are things we can do to help present the information in a way that make it useful to people and perhaps overcome some of these issues. Next slide, please. Now, obviously, the particular use of the information is going to vary a lot. And so this is just an example, a quick example from a context where the outcome information was in a highly contested political space. And this is an experiment we did, giving people information about the performance of the US Affordable Care Act. It was Obamacare, highly partisan, very divided between Democrats and Republicans. So we gave Democrats and Republicans information that showed the program was doing well, and information that showed that some aspects of the program weren't performing so well on outcomes. And this is some views of the validity, how good the evidence is for some of the pro evidence that was actually showing that some elements of Obamacare were working well. But we split our sample. Half of the people, we presented this information in the context of healthcare. We started talking about their healthcare needs, what they might want for medical provision for their families. Then we gave them the information. And under this prime, there was a much less difference in the rating of the quality of the evidence between Democrats and Republicans, then when we gave them exactly the same information, but before giving the information, we were talking very much about political issues, we were talking about who they would vote for and so on. And in that, there was a sort of gap opening up with Republicans rating the exactly the same evidence, quantitative evidence, as much less, of much lower quality than the Democrats. So obviously, the sort of thing that shows is that in politically contested areas, there's less agreement over sort of people like the facts of the matter. But it also suggests that if you can construct some consensus or shared purpose, and I think this is particularly important when there's multiple organizations involved as well, it sort of transfers to those sorts of contexts as well, then there's a much better chance of getting some consensus over the use and relevance of evidence. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to sort of finish up by just showing some of the issues around how sort of behavioral perspective, which is recognizing these sort of psychological aspects and the political context of government performance information can help. I mean, there's some simple things like presenting information graphically, and I think, Juliana was already sort of showing how sometimes a graphical presentation can help a reception of information in a way that sort of dry tables and stuff doesn't. I think embedding numbers in narratives, so that you give stories about particular people, for example, perhaps who have benefited from the program. I mean, some of your programs are around health interventions or helping training people who might be at risk of offending and so on. So if you can have a narrative about particular individuals, now of course then the choice of those narratives is very important, because you need something that is some way representative of the overall quantitative picture and the distribution of outcomes. But things, for example, perhaps giving a narrative about the average outcome for a person on a program, or giving narratives about outcomes for specific people at specific points on a distribution of outcomes. These are the sorts of things that might be useful. But then there's a whole range of sort of potential sort of recommendations, if you like, but they very much depend on the nature of the data, the recipient's characteristics. Are you communicating to citizens or service users or public managers or the funders or the investors in the case of the impact bonds and so on, because of course they're going to be very different in their characteristics and the context they're receiving the information. And of course, performance information about outcomes is only one part of policy evaluation, working out whether the organization had an effect, whether the policy is effective and so on, because then you need to have the apparatus of the research design with a sort of like a randomized control trial, comparing having the outcome from your policy with not having that policy, and but that gets us into much a broader set of debates about policy evaluation. But I think even more narrowly on this sort of perspective about how outcome measures are important, there's a few things along the lines that I was just saying that are beneficial. And just to mention a couple more, comparisons of performance are really valuable to people. So if you give someone a single piece of information, it's quite hard for them to evaluate that information. But if you can give them some sort of benchmark to evaluate against, it could be obviously historical information and looking at trend lines, but also comparisons with relevant peers, organizations, or other sort of outcomes perhaps for other areas that didn't have the investment. That is something that we know, obviously not just from a social science point of view, but is very useful for people when they're trying to make sense of those performance numbers. And then secondly, sometimes if you can try and separate out things that are to do with, let's say, harsh incentives that are linked to outcomes, if how you can kind of get prior agreement on what the outcomes are, that can help sort of reduce some of the risks of perhaps gaming or people feeling that the outcome is very much a judgment on them personally or their organization's performance, because we know in those contexts that you get a lot of potential sort of perverse and side effects from trying to use outcome measures to then inform incentives and so on. But those are just some ideas, and I'm very interested, obviously, in your experiences. So I will leave it there.
Thank you, Oliver. I remind everybody that we will have access to those slides in case you were taking frantic notes. I know some of my team was, to inform how we present information. I suggest that we move straight into our next speaker, but please don't stop posting your question. We ask Benoit Renard who is the co-founder of Triggerize. He co-founded Triggerize in 2014. Triggerize is a non-for-profit organization that aims to really bring at scale better outcome when it comes to sexual reproductive health, and is actually currently working in 6 different countries in sub-Saharan Africa. I know Benoit is working with additional countries, and is also being involved with some impact bonds. Benoit, we ask you to bring the perspective of a practitioner who works with data, uses data, reports data, and uses information to interact with a number of stakeholders that have different perspectives. So can you share some insight or some of the experience that you have on how to share this data meaningfully?
Thank you, Mara. Indeed, and maybe before I explain how we use data, just to tell you what kind of data we generate. And we call it generating because we are a platform. We have end users working out in the streets who are registered onto our digital platform, either by being provided a very physical membership card or interacting with us on WhatsApp or SMS. And every time they go to access a health service in a clinic, in a pharmacy, in a hospital that we partner with, they validate their presence in the clinic at the time of the service. This validation tells us what service they got, from whom, at what time, obviously, and where. So we get the GPS location. And that generates in real time a massive amount of data about the performance of our program. It helps us to connect and to compare to various regions, various timelines. It can help us tell us what kind of demand generation and communication campaigns are the most performant and bring the most the highest performance in the program, etc., etc. And this is for us the heart of what we do, and we believe that immediacy of the data, transparency around the data, accessibility are key and are quite novel in an industry which is non-profit industry in the public health sector, which in some of our countries have a certain level of inertia. And we believe that data can actually shake up a little bit the way we work and make us more performant. So to give you a bit of an idea, I've always promoted in this organization the idea that data was a bit like a product that you put on the shelf in a supermarket. And I think like a product, we need to think of multiple angles of it. The heart of the product, what the product is, the content is key, obviously. But it's not the only thing. I mean, Oliver, you mentioned the fact that it has to be visually, it has to make sense visually. It's the packaging of it. So like any product, you've got the product, but it has to be wrapped up into something. So the format of your data is obviously key. The way you bring it to people, so the channel you are using to make it accessible is also key. Exactly like for a product, whether you put it in Tesco or in some high-end shop, it will create a different perception on what the product is. And that's going to be the same thing with the data. And then a bit like the brand is going to be important for a product. And again, we'll, as a consumer, tell you whether it's a product that is desirable or not. The emitter of this data is going to be key. I think to your point, Oliver, if the data comes from the government, based on your biases, you may have a very different perception from the get-go. It's going to be the same thing in our industry, whether it comes from a very large and recognized NGO or from a newcomer like us, for example, it's going to differ a lot. So promoting this idea that data is not just the content, it's not just the numbers, was already something quite refreshing in the organization and with people we work with and our funders. Another element which we also borrowed from the marketing kind of angle was the notion of the receiver. So you create a product for a consumer, you need to respond to their needs. It's going to be the same thing with data. Basically, what needs in terms of data are you responding to? What are they expecting? What is their level of consumption? Are they high consumers or low consumers? And in other ways, how do you segment basically your audience? Again, exactly the way you would segment your consumer base when you promote a certain product. So in our case, And I'm going to share a few failures that we've had along the way. At one stage, we thought transparency and kind of democratization, so equity in the way we disperse our data. So everybody should have access to all of our data in the same format. It looks fantastic on paper, but the effect it has is that it never responds to everybody's needs, and in some ways it responds to nobody's needs, because it is too generic, because it hasn't been formatted and thought through a segmentation angle. I think another element that we have, obviously, visualization is key, and you know, formatting it, having a way to compare it is key. Infographics are fantastic, but exactly like for packaging for a product, you know, it's you can dress up something extremely poor with a beautiful, beautiful infographics. And we've made that mistake before, you know, incredible reports, but with very shallow data. So also trying to also be very honest with your recipients, with your target audience, and making sure that you don't start to actually misuse the power of graphics and infographics. Another hard lesson we learned was the power of real-time data. When I co-founded Triggerize, I really believe that basically real-time data would change everything, and this is true. The NGO sector I'm coming from, you know, was sometimes living out of data that were very old, like 10 years old. Even your programmatic data, by the time you get it, you know, it's 6 months old, and you have no idea, you know, what happened between those 6 months, and you know, comparison becomes very difficult. Real-time data is a bit like a drug. It's fantastic to know what happened just an hour ago, yesterday, and we all got into that drug. It does help you make very fast decisions. It helps you suddenly having a sense of ubiquity almost. You know everything that's happening everywhere, except that it makes you also, it's a double-edged sword. It makes you take very, very short, you know, very, very basic decisions based on very short-term data. You don't give yourself the time of analysis. You don't give yourself the time to compare it. And we've made mistakes in that sense, you know, starting to change our mind every 2 weeks based on the very recent understanding we had of the data without taking the time to slow down and actually start to try to reflect on it. And that element is key, the reflection, basically how to substantiate, question. I think you pointed it, Oliver, creating forums. I ended up being the one promoting for slow analysis of data, which was very contradictory to my original mindset, which was real time all the time, and creating forums, having brains in the same room, trying to interpret that very same data on the same dashboard. And that's where that transparency is good. We all have access to the same thing. Let's now use our brains to try to understand what's busy happening based on our understanding, our experience. And I thought that was the most interesting piece. So, you know, finding a way for people to also voice their understanding of it and now tell us about the qualitative aspect of this data, what their experience has been, was key. So, yeah, maybe to also to finish on that aspect about the dashboards, we've ended up actually doing something interesting to consider that those dashboards that were supposed to be the source of truth, they've become just the basis, but we've built basically products and channels around those dashboards. And that's how we've started to get better at using our data. Some of those dashboards that are available online with a login actually are rarely accessed by most of the people we wanted to target. For example, our donors. You know, our donors love the fact we have real-time data, but they don't need real-time data. Even outcome payers, you know, they're very happy if you hit your targets, etc. They don't need to see it every hour or every day. But what's interesting for them is potentially to get an extract of it on a regular basis. And there's some interesting tools that we've developed. We've got WhatsApp channels that actually you can call in data when you want. You can receive a very, you know, basic monthly newsletter with those dashboards. And that kind of sophistication of our tool became very powerful. And we've realized in that sense that making data accessible doesn't mean that it's accessed. And I think, again, and maybe that's the last word, thinking like a marketer, you know, it's not because your product is on the shelf that people are going to love your product and they're going to use it. So again, always refining your way to promote this data and to make it happen, to make it accessible so that people actually make sense of it.
Thank you, Benoit. The really, really rich of advice, and thank you in particular for sharing things you tried and found out didn't quite work as you anticipated. Before I ask Professor James to respond, I want to take a pause and check if there are questions from the audience. El, you ask a question, you want to share your question, although Professor James already answered in the chat.
Yeah, I did. Thank you very much for sharing those resources. It was a question really about benchmarks and baselines. There's been a bit in the chat going on about this, and often when in my research, I found that there are often a number of potentially relevant benchmarks, and the preference for benchmarks might shift for different stakeholders. And again, I think there might be a political dimension to some of this sometimes as well. So it was just whether you had any reflections on the appropriateness of overlaying multiple benchmarks simultaneously, or how to navigate in a world of many benchmarks.
Yes, I think this is a fascinating question. And of course, you can have the same data and then package it up and segment it in different ways for different audiences, for different purposes. And I think this is the best way to do it. I mean, in the area of local government that I'm most familiar with, and so I'm doing some work currently with Natural England, who are the government's nature advisors, and we're working with local governments on measuring environmental outcomes. And a lot of that's going to be around comparisons between local areas. And of course, there the question is, who are the relevant comparators? And some local governments have benchmarking clubs. So if you're Bristol, you might be particularly interested in Nottingham, Sheffield, and Manchester, but less interested in, I don't know, Truro and Dorking, because so having enabling people to access and define their relevant peers so that they can segment the data against the comparators that they think are useful. I think is one way of doing that. I mean, obviously, if you have sort of non-technical users as well, then that they might just need sort of more simple comparisons, and you have sort of classic things around benchmarks, comparing with a mean as opposed to a median outcome, and things like the extremes of outliers affecting distributions of performance. But I think where you have multiple units doing the same kind of thing, schools or hospitals and so on, I think there's a great deal of potential for having sort of different groups of comparators. And just also to follow up on so this is also the Benoit's point about packaging and presenting. I mean, to me, a lot of this sounds like sort of the work we do with sort of dashboards. And if you have a sort of like a classic dashboard, because a dashboard is the sort of metaphor of almost like a car dashboard with a speedometer and an oil pressure gauge. So you're really interested in that real-time monitoring. But actually, sometimes for public accountability or for evaluation, we have a different time frame. So we want really the data that's perhaps more validated, that's over a period of months or a couple of years. And there again, it's about sort of accessing the data in the appropriate time frame for the audience and the purpose to which it's being used. And it's less of a sort of like a car dashboard that you're using for driving the car real time. It's more for that purpose of accountability or longer term evaluation.
Thank you, Oliver. I would be curious to hear Benoit's response to this question, but before giving you the microphone, I'll ask Will to share his question to you, Benoit, and then you can answer both of them. Will.
Yeah, I was just saying on your point about real-time data that I experience the same thing where people don't check it every day and aren't like checking it minute by minute. But you quite often find people saying, oh, can I have the latest data on this now? And you don't know when that is. So having the real-time data is useful at the same time as not like something that people say they need or seem to want. And I don't know whether you've experienced that with your work.
Totally. And that's how we invented that little thing of getting data on demand by WhatsApp. So at the moment we've got the ability, you press 2 buttons and you get the up-to-date data, because we realize that, and that's maybe where the channel becomes important. Then the format of having to go into login, remember your password, log into this dashboard, uploading it, your network is not working properly. And then people get, they get bored, and you can see that basically people don't access it anymore. So real time, in fact, for most of our stakeholders, to your point, is about up-to-date data and having the ability to call this data whenever they want. And that becomes a powerful tool. Yeah, I agree. And actually, Oliver, that's a bit also the point you were making, like the comparison with a car. Yeah, the kind of real-time drive of a car, and I mean that's if you want I love basically in the context of an impact bond, for example, at the moment, it is absolutely amazing to have this real-time data. We do check on it, you know, permanently. We see outcome, you know, all of our outputs and outcomes. We can see where the money goes. We can see when we are burning hot. And in that sense, it's like driving a car. But we are like 5 of us in the organization, like completely obsessed about this. The rest of the organization takes offsets of this, uses other levels, and sometimes not, you know, a requirement for further analysis in order for them to do their job properly. Yeah.
Thank you, Benoit. On the WhatsApp, there is a question by Emily, and maybe you can pick it up in the chat. Andrew, you've been sharing some good practices. I wonder if you want to comment it live.
Hi, yeah, the two things that I put in the chat are where there are very, very similar services launched around the same time, then it can be useful to compare against those. So, I mean, an obvious example would be the family therapy project across London. There was an outcomes contract that worked with families in 10 boroughs across London, and in a very similar time period, there was a inputs-based, more traditional project launched in neighbouring boroughs. Actually, one of the boroughs was the same, and that didn't publish data that was as granular as the fantastic stuff that the GoLab is publishing, but it published some data, so you can make basic comparisons of, you know, the number of families helped and how many completed and how many went into care afterwards. So that's kind of one comparison. And then another comparison is all of the stuff that the Office for National Statistics publishes. So again, in children's social care, the ONS publishes some really good granular data on every single council in the country. And to enable benchmarking, it creates what it calls statistical neighbours. So you can use the online tool on the DfE's website to compare individual councils against councils that the ONS has deemed to be statistically kind of similar enough to be interesting. And then you can track a whole range of measures of how each council is doing against its statistical neighbours. So that and it doesn't sort of get to the bottom of exactly what caused the change, but if there has been a major change, you can see it in that data.
Thank you, Andrew. James, do you want to share your reflection? It's a very profound reflection. And then Professor James, I would like to come to you for more generic comments on Benoit experience. James.
Thanks, Mara. Well, it was simply just listening to the discussion, which is very diligently and academically looking at the fact that, you know, we want to have comparison groups of data in order to assess. And as you know, the speakers have said, it's very profound when you have comparisons of data sets. But what we don't often think about is that context of where that data has typically been lacking and where the step change has occurred in terms of collecting data by a particular process or a particular way of doing things. And I think too often people look at data sets when you have a new set of information and start to pick holes in it, not acknowledging the fact that actually it's been a massive improvement in where you were before. I think it's sort of likening it to getting a new car. You can sometimes sit in your new car and start to find all the faults with it. If you compare it to the old car that you had that was falling to bits, you suddenly realize what a great car you've got. So I think some visualizations or some way of presenting information that just demonstrates that step change is really important.
Thank you, James. Oliver?
I'd just like to echo that, and also I think when it comes to making the case for investment in better data and data processing, I think that's quite important, that we can kind of show to people, particularly who are not sort of have so much with the technical skill sets, why this is useful for making better policy. And really, in fact, if you think about it, it's shocking how little information that was available previously. I also think some of these outcome measures, when they have the comparability, can then get us into questions around sort of causality potentially, So, for example, I mean, obviously, we'd like to do randomized controlled trials with outcomes measured across randomized units to different policies. But when we can get better data to enable matching of areas, or even to use quasi-experimental methods, things like synthetic controls, where we kind of construct a synthetic sort of local government for an area that has done something new, and then make the comparisons and so on. I think these kinds of initiatives that look and see what the sort of comparability is between multiple units, then that helps us there. And of course, as well as sort of outcome measures in some areas, like, I mean, they're slightly controversial, but in education, the sort of the value added measures try to take account of contextual differences as well, to look at the outcomes in the light of the contextual differences, which is as people are saying, is really important. And also just to flag up the use of this information, I think Ruth Dixon's just put up around sort of data sharing clubs where there are sort of no blame type discussions about outcomes, rather than people feeling that they're very much sort of accountable. Because as I was mentioning, in the presentation, when people's use and reception of information is very much how they feel it's going to be used, or used potentially against them. And we know in the public sector, another big finding has been a finding of negativity bias. So data that shows a pattern of performance below the mean, or particularly poor performance, is something that's driven disproportionate amount of interest in change, and that includes, obviously, if you think about leadership, consequence for leaders in hospitals and schools and so on, that has been a sort of major issue in reception and use of sort of information.
Thank you, Oliver. And Ruth also pointed out an example in the chat of the no blame clubs. Emily, earlier on in the chat, you mentioned the database that you have on digital tools, and you said that some include visualization and others do not. I don't know if you have a reflection or you have a pattern of why some do and some don't.
Sure, I can jump in. So, I mean, I don't think we know why some do and why some don't, but we did categorize in the database tools that solely collect data, tools that collect and analyze data, tools that collect, analyze data, and provide visualization. So that's a search feature in the database. But yeah, certainly interesting. And I think that the point on you can collect all the data you want, but one, it has to be the right data, and two, if nobody's using the data, then it doesn't, it's not very helpful. So I think all of those points around sort of how to make the data, or how to put the data in a format that is best interpreted and used and put to use is really necessary. Thanks, Mara.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. I have a question I want to pick up on one of your last points, Oliver, on this focus on when there is some negative results that attracts disproportionate attention. And in particular, I think like one of the things that we try to do at the Go Lab is to try to create and support a learning mindset. And these data and the comparisons are there to reflect, learn, and make some improvement. And so a link also to what Benoit was saying about taking enough time to set back and reflect on the data. However, it seems that much of the attention will be is put on things that looks not quite working, and so we can point fingers. And so these clubs are an example of how do you create this mindset. Can you share other examples of, like, also in academia, often you can see publications that focus on mistakes that have been made and how there is no result, or the result is insufficient. So this negativity bias is there. I don't know if you have other example beside your no blame club to support this positive learning mindset within government in an open space, or does it need to be behind closed door under Chatham's rule? Any recommendations?
Well, I mean, this can be difficult, can't it? Because some of the demands for transparency have sometimes inhibited this sort of open discussion of failings, because it's felt to be a sort of secret club world, and people are not sort of hiding information from people. I mean, I think if you look more sort of broadly some of the developments of certain regulatory regimes with regard to safety, and things like in the airline industry, the idea of sort of just whistleblowing and without sort of punishment, and just trying to sort of build a safety culture that's linked to sort of an openness rather than a kind of blame culture. I think those kinds of models from regulation where those have been applied might be another area that sort of could be kind of perhaps read across to other areas of policy.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, so I just want to open the floor for the last question, if there is, or I will ask Benoit and Oliver to give a final reflection. Okay, I might come to you, Benoit, first.
I want to thank you before my reflection. Thank you, because I learned a lot. And Oliver, I'm going to borrow some elements of your deck and internally. Yeah, I mean, it's a never. I feel it's a theme that keeps on growing. I'm surprised that in this discussion we didn't talk about big data and AI. I guess because I'm poisoned with the fact that AI keeps on coming back to bite us at the moment every time we in a public space. But in the case of data, what I've realized is that this predictive analytics part is going to become actually something fascinating, and I get the feeling that maybe this whole discussion around how we make sense of our data, the slowness of the data, we may be at the end of an era, and maybe there's something extremely disruptive about to already starting. That's it.
Thank you, Benoit. Oliver.
Yes, I think I just, really interesting discussion, and I just sort of reiterate perhaps if you like, the framework for thinking about some of these things. That it's the nature of the data, the nature of the recipients, and the purpose to which the data is being used, and the context. And that's the sort of very general framework, but within that you can kind of situate a lot of very sort of more specific things that are particular and relevant to a case. I do think the whole thing around data analysis of large data. I mean, we do have the capacity for obviously generating a lot of data through administrative and routine processes, so that helps lower the cost of data collection, and that's great. I think sometimes its incorporation in forms of AI can potentially be troubling if there's all this sort of generative processes going on here, which are not always transparent and so on. But that gets us into debates around the role of AI. But just sort of say things around the credibility of data and source credibility is something that if you have data and it's said it's got no NIS seal of approval, do tell people that, because it helps sort of boost the credibility and overcome some of these potential objections to people sort of dismissing the data.
Thank you. I'll wrap up here. I just want to say that at GoLab we are making treasure of the recommendation to improve how we present information. And we have your book and your slide, Oliver. I was also taking frantic notes on your suggestion, Benoit. Maybe we should write them up as a short briefing for data enthusiasts of our Indigo audience. So I just stop here, and I want to thank in particular Professor James, Benoit, Juliana, and all of you for such an interesting conversation and challenging questions. Thank you, and see you at the next session. If we don't see you before, as I probably won't, I just wish you everyone a nice holiday seasons and a good start in 2024.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks very much.